Welcome to Metamorphose, the podcast that awakens awareness. I am Anne Guéquière, author and editor of projects committed to a new world. Every week, we go together to discover a bright subject with a guest that carries a voice of awareness. Thank you for being with us today.
Metamorphose. Awaken your consciousness.
Happiness remains a vast field of investigation for the human psyche. Between the guilt of the investigator who wonders whether it's indecent to talk about happiness in a world full of misfortunes, and the desire to share miracle, recipes for better self-preservation, how can we approach the theme of happiness today, especially when we want to do it in a serious, objective, and scientific way? That's what my guest of the day is looking for. Without failing into the naive positivism of a Coué method that would involve denying the difficulties of reality, this professor of happiness brings us teachings based on scientific truth to better hold on, to better preserve ourselves in today's context of real violence. The famous author of L'apprentissage de l'imperfection, Conversation avec mon coiffeur, et Le bonheur d'être leader, his book, Mon cours de bonheur, just published by Robert Laffon, takes an interdisciplinary approach to the notion of happiness, touching on philosophy, psychology, neuroscience. This is the first time we have him in the Metamorphosis podcast. He's a doctor of psychology and philosophy, known at Harvard University as the professor of happiness to the thousands of students who have been lucky enough to have him, including myself. This is an honor. It's a delight to welcome Tal Ben-Shahar to Metamorphose podcast. Hello, Tal.
Hi, Guila. It's so good to be here.
Thank you again to accept our invitation. So, to consider the notion of happiness today, and particularly from a French point of view, is difficult. It's even indecent. Indeed, how could I imagine myself happy when so many people are suffering? And yet your approach is that of a pedagogical approach to happiness. So before you start your course on happiness, how can we overcome this resistance, this guilt about embarking on this quest?
Yeah, so this is a very important question, and it's a question that has been on people's mind for many years, and of course became even more extreme during difficult times, such as the pandemic or war, or being preview to the misery of others. You know, what right do I have to be happy? And the answer is that this guilt comes from a misunderstanding of happiness. You know, happiness is not just about smiling and experiencing joy and having fun. Happiness is a much deeper construct than that. Happiness includes painful emotions, and happiness also includes deep relationships. Happiness includes learning. Happiness includes meaning. Now, when you look at happiness as a multi-dimensional construct, including all those things, you also realize that happiness is not a zero-sum game. What does this mean? A zero-sum game means that when I have more of something, you necessarily have less of it. In other words, if we apply this to happiness, if I'm happier, it means that by definition, because it's a zero-sum game, you're less happy, you're more miserable. It turns out, though, that with happiness, it's a positive-sum game. Meaning, if I increase my levels of well-being, and again, not the shallow, superficial happiness, but deep happiness, which again includes the full range of human emotions, which includes a sense of meaning and purpose, which includes lifelong learning, and so on. When I increase my levels of happiness, it actually contributes to yours. In other words, when I increase my levels of happiness, I'm contributing to a happier world. And therefore, not only is guilt unwarranted, it becomes imperative, it becomes even more important to work on my happiness so that others can increase theirs. In other words, increasing my levels of well-being actually reduces the overall misery around us.
So if I understand correctly, your way of being happy is a way to be fully alive. Is that correct?
It's about looking at the full range of human emotions. It's about looking at the full capacity, potential of humans for living. And this is, going back to the ancient Greeks or ancient Chinese philosophers who, when they talked about happiness, did talk exactly, Guila, as you mentioned, about a full and fulfilling life, a life that is worthy of humans.
So once we've jumped the guilt trap, let's push open the classroom door and attend your lesson. And of course, first and foremost, the definition of happiness that already presupposes an awareness and a rejection of certain preconceptions, doesn't it?
It's exactly that. So when you ask most people, okay, so what is happiness? They would say, it's about having fun. It's about laughing. And this is a shallow, modern conception of happiness. Once again, if you go back to the sources, what the Greeks discussed and what the ancient Chinese philosophers discussed, and you put that together with modern research and modern science, what we have is a model of happiness that looks at the well-being of the whole person. Now, what does the well-being of the whole person include? Let me share 5 elements which, drawing on research and drawing on philosophy, the 5 elements that are the most important. The first element is spiritual well-being. So spiritual well-being is, of course, we can find it going to church or synagogue or mosque in religion. However, we can also find it when we experience a sense of purpose and meaning in our life. So if I find my work meaningful, or if I find my volunteering activity meaningful, or I found my relationship meaningful, I'm experiencing spiritual well-being. Spiritual well-being is also about being present, being in the here and now. And this could happen while I'm in a conversation with a friend and fully immersed in it. Being present can also be experienced when I meditate or when I listen to music. So these are times when we experience spiritual well-being. So to summarize, it's about a sense of meaning and purpose, and it's about mindfulness and presence. Then we have the second element of happiness, which is physical well-being. Physical well-being is about paying attention to what we eat. It's about exercise. Regular physical exercise, movement, has the same effect on our psychological well-being as our most powerful psychiatric medication. In fact, working in the same way, releasing norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. These are the feel-good chemicals in the brain. So physical well-being is an important part of a happy life, as is nutrition, as is rest and recovery in the form of sleep, for instance. Then we have intellectual well-being. Intellectual well-being is about curiosity. It turns out that people who ask questions, who are lifelong learners, who are curious, are not just happier, they're not just more successful, which they are, they also live longer. So curiosity is an important part of happiness. So is deep learning. One of the greatest problems in today's culture is that we've become superficial in our learning, in our writing, in addressing ideas. So we scan the news or we write very short text messages. And we've lost the art, the science of deep learning, which is an important part of happiness. So engaging in a philosophical text, going out to nature and studying the world around us, these have been lost to us by and large in the fast-paced modern life. And returning to it will contribute to a deep sense of happiness. So that's intellectual well-being. Then we have relational well-being. The number one predictor of happiness is quality time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. It's engaging in conversations. It's contributing to others, helping others, being kind, being generous. Again, that doesn't set up a zero-sum game. It doesn't just contribute to others. It also contributes to our well-being. In other words, giving, generosity, kindness is a win-win activity.
And of course, yes, the last, the emotional is also very important.
Exactly right. So the final one is emotional well-being. And emotional well-being is first and foremost about learning to deal with painful emotions, such as sadness and anger and frustration and anxiety. And these are natural human emotions. And the question is only, what do we do with these emotions? Do we accept and embrace them, or do we reject and deny them? And the paradox is that when we reject and deny these emotions, they grow stronger. And it's when we accept and embrace, give ourselves the permission to be human, that's when we're in the best position to deal with them. Emotional well-being is not just about dealing with painful emotions. It's of course also generating pleasurable emotions, such as joy and fun and gratitude.
So this is really your interdisciplinary approach, the Spire, the famous Spire that you develop in your book and in your class. So how could we try to apply that in a day-to-day life?
Yeah, so of course the biggest question when it comes to the science of happiness is application. This is not theoretical physics. This is not a philosophical class where we only delve into the depth of the idea. This is very much about application. And the key when it comes to application is often to do less rather than more. Because if I have a list of 20 things that I'm going to apply in my life and transform my life, I'm actually likely to do nothing. So it's better to take small steps. For example, let's say I decide to focus on physical well-being, and I introduce 3 half-hour walks or excursions to the gym a week. That in and of itself can make a big difference if I do it consistently. Or let's say I decide to add an extra 2 hours a week to learning, to delving deeply into certain topic. That will contribute to my overall happiness, of course, through the intellectual well-being channel. Or I may decide to spend more quality time with my loved ones while my phone is off and I'm not distracted by technology. That will significantly contribute to my well-being. Or maybe I decide to start a gratitude journal before going to bed at night, spending 2 minutes, 3 minutes, thinking about what I can appreciate from the day just past. So these are all activities and nothing major, small activities that can actually make a big difference. Again, the key is to engage in them consistently on a regular basis.
Do you advise one after the other? Do you advise, let's say, to make some scales, like an artist would do? So let's say 1 week we focus on the S of the spiritual, another week would be more about the physical. What is the frequency?
Yes, so here we need to look at our individual needs and wants because we're all different. My suggestions is about starting with what is easiest, the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Why? Because that's where we're most likely to persist. So, for example, for me, it may be easiest to start spending more quality time with my loved ones. Or it may be easiest to, start a new online course and study. Or it may be easiest to start walking. Also within activity, start where it's easiest, where it's the most fun. So if I decide to become more physically active, what do I enjoy most? Do I enjoy going to the gym? Or do I enjoy going for a walk? Or do I perhaps want to start dancing? It doesn't matter what I do as long as I do it and do it consistently. Exercise or engage in learning or engage with people. Whatever is most comfortable and where I'm most likely to persist. That's where I would start.
So, Tal, you mean that you don't have to suffer to be more happy?
It is actually a complicated question, Guila. The short answer is no, you don't. However, you do need to work. You do need to put in effort. Mathieu Ricard, the mindfulness teacher, talks about how we have essentially a double standard, where if we want to become better at music or sports, we know we have to put in the work. Whereas when it comes to the realm of self-help, of well-being, of happiness, we think, I just need to read the book or listen to the podcast or take a class. And unfortunately, it's not enough. We need to practice, just like we practice on the piano regularly or work out on the tennis court regularly. If we want to become better musicians or better athletes, we need to do the same with happiness. It's a skill we need to practice.
Could you give us significant anecdotes about the use of the Spire? I'm thinking about, all the 1,000 students you may have, or people who attended your conference, or even you. How did you use the Spire when you feel, for example, that there is one dimension that you are lacking, let's say, from time to time?
Yeah, so let me give you an example from COVID. So many people ask me, so Tal, during COVID, what did you do differently? Or what did you do in order to deal with it? Because, most people, and I was no exception, experienced more stress. We have 3 kids, so they were all at home and doing their schooling there. Work wasn't going well. I wasn't traveling the world and giving lectures. And there was a lot of stress on many levels, whether it's a relational stress, whether it's economic stress. And so what did I do? And what I did was I went back to basics, only more of them. So if during the regular times, I would exercise 3 times a week, during COVID, I increased that to 5 or 6 times a week because I really felt that I needed it. I needed an extra dose, just like you would need an extra dose of medicine. Well, given that exercise functions like our most powerful psychiatric medication, I needed more of it. So I exercised 5 or 6 times a week. I'll give you another example. We know that, and there's a lot of research on this, that journaling contributes to well-being. So when we write about our emotions, when we express rather than suppress our anxiety or frustration or anger, when we do it in writing, it contributes significantly to our overall happiness. So usually, on average, I write in my journal maybe every 10 days or 2 weeks. Well, during COVID or in general during stressful times, I write at least 3 times a week. In fact, whenever I feel that the stress rises or the anxiety begins to creep in, I sit down and I write and I express my emotions, and that helps a great deal. So again, it's doing the same things. It's going back to basics. This is no rocket science. We know of these things. However, it's about applying them, and sometimes it's applying them more often.
It's even harder because we are the patient and the doctor at the same time. So to have the critical distance, it's difficult, to prescribe ourselves something because the patient doesn't want to follow the doctor, and at the same, so not to become completely, multi-profile,
But, Guila, this is why it's so important, again, always, and especially in difficult times, to reach out to others. Because, no person is an island. We don't need to go alone. Never, and especially when the going gets tough. So we know, for instance, that I mentioned earlier that the number one predictor of happiness is quality time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. It's not just the number one generator of happiness. It's also the number one thing in terms of helping us become more resilient, better deal with difficult experiences. So when the situation is difficult, again, whether it's because of a pandemic or because of war or because of economic pressures, whatever the reason, this is the time to reach out, to talk to share with people who genuinely care about us, whom we trust. And again, this could be a therapist, it could be a coach, it could also be my partner or best friend or colleague whom I trust.
Yes, so really trying to help with catharsis. Another way is also art. As you know that I'm really dealing with theater, that I like that. So art, do you believe that art could also be a way to do the catharsis of this emotional, willingness to be expressed?
One of the things that I teach in my classes is, of course, intellectual well-being. And the thing that I emphasize when I talk about intellectual well-being is that intelligence is not just language and mathematics. Drawing on the important work of Howard Gardner on multiple intelligences. How we express ourselves intellectually, what we learn, what we connect to intellectually is different for different people. And in fact, very often when a rational approach to dealing with our emotions or a rational approach to understanding ourselves may not work, and the indirect way through art, whether it's through painting or music, whether it's generating music or listening to music, whether it's acting, whether it's observing others act, these are all invaluable ways to deal with hardships and difficulties, and of course, to increase our overall levels of happiness.
In terms of, fake it till you make it, is it something that you advise also, especially when it comes to the physical approach? We remind, our listeners that the fake it till you make it is a way for the body to be in a certain position, as Amy Cuddy is saying, in order to psychologically be more ready to just do the action.
You see, there is, so the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is yes, absolutely. But let me elaborate on it. So our bodies and our minds are interconnected. In the West, we have a tendency, since Descartes, or even before Descartes, to distinguish between mind and body, to address them as two separate entities. Well, they're not. They intimately are connected. They affect one another constantly. In other words, and this is what explains the research on power poses, for example, when we sit up straight, we actually feel better about ourselves. When we're slouched, we feel worse. When we smile, that actually releases certain chemicals that make us feel better. When we frown, the opposite happens, and we actually feel worse. So mind and body affect one another. It's not just when we're happy, we smile. It's also when we smile, we become happier. It's not just that when we're confident, we have our shoulders back and stand up straight. It's also when we have our shoulders straight and back and stand up straight that we become more confident. Two sides of the same coin. Now, we can exploit this connection for the purpose of our overall well-being. How? Let's say I'm feeling down. I can go out of my way and help other people, and through helping other people, actually feel better. Why? Because people who feel good about themselves are ones who go and help others. But because there are two sides of the same coin, people who help others will also feel better about themselves. Or to give you another example, when I'm feeling down, I really don't feel like exercising. However, I can push myself, go exercise, and actually feel better as a result. Even if initially while I exercise, I don't feel great about myself. So I fake it. So I pretend like I want to exercise and I actually do it, and then I feel better about it. In other words, we don't need to wait to feel like exercising to exercise. We don't need to wait to feel like spending time with our loved ones to do it. I don't need to wait to feel like learning something new in order to learn it. I can just learn. So the key here is to start with action. And after action may come the motivation, or may come the better feeling, or may come the happiness. I needn't need to wait to feel good to do good. I can do good and as a result feel good or feel better.
So we work on the assumption that everyone wants to preserve themselves, to get better, to be happy. But how can we dialogue with people who don't seem to have this goal in mind when egos gets in the way at work, for example, or even at home or in war? So suddenly we realize that happiness is completely different for certain people.
You see, it's very difficult to change other people. It's difficult enough to change ourselves, and that's where we need to begin. Now, this doesn't mean we should give up on others. At the same time, we need to also recognize our limitation. The best way to help other people is to start with the self. Why? Because so many of our emotions and our activities are contagious. So for instance, if I smile and someone sees me smiling, whether they like it or not, there are certain neurons in their brains that actually fire, associated with a better feeling. Now, they may smile back at me, in which case it's even more powerful. But even if they don't smile back at me, something happens in their brain through what neuroscientists call the mirror neurons. Even more than that, when I commit an act of kindness and others see me doing it, they're more likely to themselves engage in an act of kindness. So kindness is contagious. When my children or my colleagues at work see me learning, engaging in new material, they are more likely to learn and engage in new material. So intellectual well-being is contagious. If my employees or children see me exercising regularly, they're more likely to do the same. So what I'm saying here is that to impact others, the first, and I would argue the best way, is to change ourselves, to practice the activities that then others are likely to follow. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
Lead by example, in other words.
That's
one way. Guila, but that's only one way of helping others. Perhaps the best, but it's one. A second way of helping others is through sharing, through stories. Not by going and saying, starting to lecture to them, but sharing your own story. Perhaps how once you started exercising regularly, it changed your life for the better. Or sharing a story about kindness and generosity that was done to you, where you were the recipient of such act. And stories often do have an impact on other people because we connect to them.
I understand. As a coach, a lot of people come to me asking about obstructive behavior, passivity, aggressivity, manipulation. So here we are in front of bad faith. So what you describe is really linked to this notion of the power of kindness. But how to be kind when you have in front of yourself people who is not kind and actually who really wants, on the contrary, really harm yourself or harm someone you like. So here, how happiness could reinforce ourselves, even working on ourselves in order to be not only kinder but stronger.
So, first of all, when happiness is not a panacea, it doesn't solve everything. It's not like, okay, so I introduce happiness studies into communities or schools, and then we'll live happily ever after and we'll have universal peace. I wish that were the case. It's not. So sometimes the way to deal with unkindness is to simply get away from it. It's simply, as much as possible, to avoid it. At the same time, what the cultivation of happiness, or all these conditions that I talked about, whether it's spiritual well-being or physical or intellectual or relational or emotional well-being, what cultivating these does is it helps us better deal with the challenges and the difficulties and the hardships of the world. Because we strengthen ourselves, we create a stronger foundation upon which we build and from which we can resist, whether it's an onslaught of unkindness or anger. And when we are in a place like this, we're more likely also to help others, as I mentioned earlier, strengthen their foundations and also better able to deal with unkindness or anger or any other form of hurt.
You were talking about happiness not bringing, of course, peace. What do you think of this idea of United Nations declaring March 20 as a World Happiness Day?
So first of all, I think it's a great start because it increases levels of awareness about the importance of happiness. The key, though, is for this declaration to be aligned with action. Now, what does action look like? Well, action, in my world at least, has to do with education. So just as students in school around the world learn mathematics or learn language, or they should in the same way learn about the science of well-being, about happiness. Because what we know is that when we increase happiness, it's not just good in and of itself. It actually helps people become more generous and more moral. It also helps people become more creative and productive and better students. So happiness is not just nice to have. It's not just an end in itself that we aspire to. It's also a means towards other desirable ends, such as productivity or creativity or teamwork in the organizations or relationships in general.
Yeah, in your book, you're talking about how this could be also applied in a school, for example. So from a very young age, could you give us any type of program that has been done in school right now, really dealing with happiness? Of course, we have also the economic happiness approach from Bhutan, for example, but maybe you could give us an idea of an approach specifically that has been done for school.
So one of my teachers, Professor Martin Seligman, when he speaks with parents and teachers, always asks them two questions. The first question is, what would you most like for your children? And the parents or the teachers respond, I want them to be happy, or I want them to be resilient, or I want them to have good relationships, or I want them to be healthy. And he writes whatever they say on the board. That's list number one. And then he says, okay, question number 2 for list number 2. What do children learn in school? And that list, and the answer to this question is writing and mathematics and reading and geography and history and biology and so on. Unfortunately, there's almost no overlap between the two lists. The first list being what parents or teachers most want for their children, and the second list is what children learn in school. And that's unfortunate, especially today, given that we have a science of happiness, and given that, as I mentioned earlier, if we do work on list number 1, if we do increase their levels of well-being and resilience, they'll also become better students, perform better in writing and reading and mathematics and geography. And the big question is, why don't school introduce, as part of the curriculum, the study of well-being? Not in a self-help or new age way, in a scientific way. And this is what we have been doing in a number of schools around the world, from the United States to Latin America, to Asia and the Middle East. And what we have found is that when teachers, in a scientific way, introduce happiness to the classroom, the benefit goes far and wide. It improves relationships of teachers to students and students among themselves. What we see is that students actually perform better. Their grades go up. Not to mention the fact that they're kinder, more generous. There's less violence, whether verbal or physical violence, in those schools. So it's a win-win all around, to the individual, to the classroom, to the school, and ultimately to society, because these are our future.
So what type of exercises those kids are doing? Is it based on Spire? Do they learn Spire from a very young age? Could you give us just something simple that we could do, for example, to our kids?
Good. So the kids in those schools become more physically active. More and more schools are taking away physical exercise because they want to fit more academic subjects. We increase the amount of time that children exercise. They engage in mindfulness practices. Now, not mindfulness practices where they meditate for an hour a day or do yoga for 90 minutes. That would be nice, but it's not realistic. But even having a mindful minute, where they just close their eyes and breathe deeply, focusing on the air going in and out for 60 seconds. That can go a long way in igniting, in triggering the parasympathetic system, the relaxation response, in the words of Harvard professor Herbert Benson. In addition, they express gratitude for what they did during the day or during the week, and they take this exercise and they do it at home with their families. I can't tell you how many times parents who were aware of the program that we introduced in the school thanked me for bringing this simple activity or the 1-minute breath activity to their families, because they engage in it after school as well. In addition, there are inspiring quotes around the school reminding students of being kind, or of breathing deeply, or of accepting their emotions. So these are all mini triggers that help them apply the Spire elements, again, spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional elements in their lives. So the main point here, Guila, is that small changes, small activities can and do make a big difference when consistently applied.
So could you tell us what is PTG and how this could help us also in terms of resilience as defined by Boris Cyrulnik?
So one of the things that I ask my students, and remember most of them, not all, but most of them are psychology students, is to put their hands up if they know what PTSD is. And just about every student puts their hand up. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I ask them to put down their hands and then to put up their hands again if they know what PTG is. Hardly any student puts their hand up. PTG stands for post-traumatic growth. Now, here is the thing. Post-traumatic growth is actually twice as likely as post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, we're twice as likely to grow from hardships and difficulties and even traumas than we are to break down as a result of hardships, traumas, and difficulties. If, and this is a very big if we know about the possibility of post-traumatic growth and we know what conditions to put in place. Now, most people don't know about post-traumatic growth. They've never heard about it. And most people certainly don't know what conditions they can put in place to increase the likelihood thereof. And here is the thing. What the science of happiness does, and this is why it's so important, especially in difficult times, what the science of happiness does is introduce us to concepts, to ideas such as post-traumatic growth, and it teaches us what we need to put in place for ourselves, for our children, in our organizations, in our society, what we need to put in place in order to increase the likelihood of post-traumatic growth. The things that we need to put in place, Guila, are exactly the things that we talked about today. Exercise more regularly. Spend more time with your loved ones, quality time with them. Learn more. Express gratitude on a regular basis. Take more deep breaths. Maybe introduce 1 minute or 5 minutes of mindfulness practice a day. These are all things that help us not just deal with difficulties, hardships, and challenges. They also help us potentially grow from these experiences.
Thank you very much, Tal. Maybe a last question. What was the most beautiful compliment you received from one of your students in class after following your class of happiness?
The most beautiful compliments to me, what reminds me why I do what I do, is when students or clients tell me that they have implemented an idea. Just to hear that, oh, this is a wonderful idea and this is interesting. Of course I like hearing it, but it's not as meaningful as hearing I implemented this, in my family, at work, and this has made a difference, a positive difference in my life.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tal. Yes, of course, we will apply all the advice you gave us in order to cope with this very violent world we are living in today. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to look at this interdisciplinary approach to happiness. I highly recommend everybody to read this book, Mon Cours de Bonheur, published by Robert Laffon, which is, of course, already a bestseller in the USA. Thank you. We wish you all the best. Thank you, Tal, for being with us.
And thank you, Guila, for all the amazing work that you do.
Check out the special guest of the week on Instagram at Metamorphose Podcast. If you like this podcast, promote it by giving it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to follow all the episodes for free.
Metamorphose. Awaken your consciousness.